Welcome to another Good Eye Podcast. I'm Jay Smack. Today, my guest is Maryfrances Porter from Partnerships for Strategic Impact, analyzing data and helping nonprofits understand that data to more effectively tell their story. Let's get right into it. And welcome to another Good Eye Podcast. I'm Jay Smack. And with me today is Maryfrances Porter. Maryfrances, thank you very much for being here today.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah. When I saw you speak at a recent Synapse meeting, I thought it'd be a really good topic because a lot of nonprofits don't do as much of or do not pay as much attention to, perhaps as they should, to what it is that you specialize in, which is capturing and using data to the advantage of your client, in this instance, nonprofits. So I do like to get into these discussions of what could nonprofits be doing to help themselves, and the answer is often behave more like a for-profit. So, if you don't mind, give us a little description of kind of what it is you do, the Cliff Notes version, and how you help nonprofits perform and grow and pay attention to their bottom line, and then we'll get into the guts of it.
Okay. So kind of in brief, what I have experienced. So I've been doing this with nonprofits for more than 20 years, and I'm trained as a scientist. And so I've done, scientific program evaluation and used science to study like longitudinal groups of people to see what happens as they get older. And when I first started working with nonprofits, I really felt quite puzzled because it seemed impossible for nonprofits to use the science, to take the science that I knew and insert it into their organization and use it. And over time, I came to the conclusion that that is because it's impossible. And that a lot of times what happens is that the science of program evaluation and the practice of understanding the impact you're making gets confused. And so when nonprofits should be collecting their impact and understanding what impact they're making, that doesn't have to look like science, but there's no model for how to do that. Like what's included, what are the steps, how does it work? And so what I've done is I've created a model that nonprofits can learn and plug in and use to collect their impact, to understand their impact, to be able to talk about their impact in about the same with about the same level of difficulty as managing a budget. So it's not nothing to set up, because just like setting up your budget system, it takes a bit of work. But once it's going, it really does not have to be super complicated. And, when nonprofits, when we talked about for-profits and nonprofits, and for-profits, they're able to measure their success by their how much money they make, right? And, so they put in money, they have investors, they sell a product, people buy the product, and they make money. And that money is the return on their investment. And in nonprofits, they're a corporation also, but they're spending money, people are investing in them, people are using it. But then what do they produce? They produce goodness. And that's can be really hard to measure. And I think that that's where they get stuck. I think a lot of nonprofits want to measure it, know it's important to measure, but how do they do it? And it's because there really isn't a model out there.
Okay, so they use data. They hire a company like yours, which is, I don't think I even mentioned, Partnerships for Strategic Impact, to help them know what they don't know. You say there's no real method to measure their profit, i.e. their goodness that they're putting into the community, the universe. What do they use to measure it, and how do they know? Is it mainly operating costs? I mean, what are they measuring if they don't know how to tell their story?
So a lot of times when nonprofits are not tracking an amount of goodness, when they can't quantify it, and they're just sort of doing their regular awesome nonprofit work, a lot of times what they do is they talk about the number of people served and they have testimonials, like narrative stories about how people have been helped by them. And those are actually really important. And we know that especially individual donors are really drawn in by those stories. They want to know that they're helping a person. If I personally am donating $100, I want that $100 to help an individual. And so when you're looking for individual donors, that might be useful. But when you're trying to get foundations or grants or something like that, you usually need to not just show that people like what you do and that they got better, which is always important, but you kind of need to quantify it. You kind of need a number that says not only did, Janice get better, but 80% of the people we served got better just like Janice. And that builds trust and credibility. And that number is something that investors understand, right? People who are investors are kind of focused on numbers. And this gives them a number that they can kind of hang their hat on and understand.
Okay. When you get into, say, ratios, a nonprofit takes in, say, $100, and $30 of that, it goes back to the organization to run it and cover overhead. Is there a good ratio? Does it vary, nonprofit, mission to mission, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
No, I mean, it really doesn't. I don't think, and I think that the line between what's operational costs and what's programming costs is just not actually even a line, because you couldn't deliver programming without a vital organization. So if the people delivering the programming don't have the tools that they need and don't have the support that they need and don't have a computer and things like that and supervision, they can't deliver good work. So I really see it all as one pot of money. And then the amount that it costs to do the work, right? Like, so you have a budget of a nonprofit, and let's say it's, for the ease of math, let's say it's $10,000 and they serve 100 people. Is that a good ratio of like cost per person? Well, it really kind of depends on what they're providing, right? If they're providing hats, no, that's not a very good ratio. But if they are providing, 6 months of food, or, marketable skills or safe housing or something, then that might be a really good number. In the market, in the regular market, in the capital market, you kind of have an idea of what a good return on investment is, right? Because you have an amount of money coming in, you can just see how much more money you made. But when you're measuring goodness, that's really rooted in your value. Do you value the goodness that's being delivered? And if you value that, then you're going to invest in it. And if you might not devalue it, but you might value something else more. And so then you might invest in that. And wrapped up in there is how many people they're serving. Serving people with less money isn't always better. It just sort of depends on the complexity of what you're doing and the complexity of the result that you're getting.
Okay. So from an analysis of data perspective, do you think it's a bad idea to judge nonprofits based on, quote unquote, the good that they do? And the example I'll use, and a lot of people point to, is distribution of mosquito netting in areas where malaria can be spread. Supposedly, and this is sort of, I guess, just a myth or a story of the industry, if you will, of nonprofits, that is doing the most good, in the most concentrated way, saving the most lives, versus, say, providing wheelchairs to vets. And I'm just making that up.
Sure.
I'm not citing anything necessarily, but is that a slippery slope that you advise people not to go down based on what we were just talking about?
There's an organization, I forget what it is, but it actually lists big nonprofit impact, and they quantify it and they rank it, right? So you've got some nonprofits like, the Gates Foundation, I think, is the one that puts out nets. They save lots and lots of lives, and nets are really, really cheap. And so if you want to put in a little bit of money and know that you're helping lots of people be safe, then you should invest in mosquito netting. Mm-hmm. But that might not be what you value. I mean, you might value that, but you might value something else like local homelessness more. Or you might value making sure that people who have brain injuries are able to live long and comfortable lives in group homes. And I don't know if you can really have a horse race against, people with brain injuries living comfortably long lives in group homes and mosquito net saving lives. I don't think I don't think you can decide which is better. I think it depends on where you want to make a difference and the way in which you want to see that difference manifested. And so I think it's a little bit simplistic to say that you can rank a nonprofit that way. You rank them based on whether or not what they're producing and the amount that they're producing is in line with how you want to invest your dollars. If you were to really distill it, it's sort of like you can't really, compare a t-shirt to a formal blouse or something, right? But which one are you wanting to buy? And that has to do with which one you need, which one you value, which one you don't have. It's a much more qualitative kind of choice.
Yeah, that's a good point. And judging the mission or the effectiveness of an organization just based on quantifiable good is a bit reductionist to your point.
Especially if you're comparing it.
Yeah.
Like if you know that the local homeless agency is able to provide, 1,000 nights of support to people who are homeless, and they get emergency housing for 300 people a year, that is quantifiable, and you deserve to know that, and the people getting services deserve to know that. And then you can say, yeah, I want more of that. And you deserve to know that if you donate $100, 400 children in mosquito infested areas live because they don't get malaria. Which one you invest in is a personal choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I think what symbolizes that almost better than anything is pet-centered nonprofits. What's the one? I'm drawing a blank now. Fetch a Cure. It helps with, I think, terminal diseases with pets. And how do you value that versus saving children from having malaria? Well, it does get emotional, and that's sort of that's at the crux, basically, of what nonprofits are after: helping, doing good, and that's emotional. It's also beneficial from a data standpoint. But there's a part on your website that says that what you do, analyzing data, in the starkest terms, and in our pre-interview, you said sometimes bad news is good news. But one of the things you mentioned is understanding community need, and how to tell the story of what need you're addressing. Have you seen situations where maybe the data comes back after your analysis and nonprofits realize maybe they're doing the wrong thing, and maybe they change their mission a little bit?
So I haven't so much seen anyone start a nonprofit and find out that there wasn't a need for it, because most of the time when people start a nonprofit, even if they don't have the data, they know it's a problem, right? So sometimes you have to backfill the data to be able to show that this is an issue. But usually people aren't trying to solve problems that don't need solving. That's not 100% of the time, but a lot of times that happens. What I have definitely seen is I've seen nonprofits evolve what they do over time to meet the needs of the community. So they might start off doing one thing, and then they might add something else, and they might change the first thing sometimes, but not very often. They might drop the first thing and then, do a third thing. One of the unfortunate things about human need is that it's always changing and evolving and never completely solved, right? Nobody is going to actually work themselves out of a business, even though everybody is trying to work themselves out of business. They want to solve the problem, but things continue to happen, continue to churn. And so having some needs assessment data from the community and or from the people that you serve helps you be able to know that you're serving the right thing, or the thing that is most important in the community to address for your organization at that time.
That's a good point. There's a nonprofit here locally that I'm involved with, and their original mission was assisting women in financial crisis, whether it's a result of divorce or losing their job or something, and it usually manifests in the form of health care and resources for their kids. But after a couple years at it, they found they were getting a lot of feedback from men who needed the same
Yes.
assistance. And they were like, we were
Yep.
sort of short-sighted in this, not sexist
Mhm.
necessarily, but there's a lot of single fathers who need to go to work and have childcare and have those resources as well. And they've opened up their mission. And as a result, they've actually grown and been able to do a lot more, good in the community.
Well, and isn't
Yeah.
that the success of any, sorry, but isn't
Yeah.
that the success of any business? The success of a business is finding problems that need solving and then solving them,
Yeah. No,
right?
exactly right. And therein points back to the bottom line.
Mhm.
This is sort of a two-pronged question. I'm curious if you find that there are similar mistakes or different mistakes based on your analysis and your strategies that smaller, perhaps more localized nonprofits make versus larger ones, say, going back to helping single mothers in Richmond, Virginia versus the MS Society. And on the back of that question, do you find there's a common set of metrics as you use as your go-tos to analyze that and tell that story? If there are similarities or differences in
Mhm.
that.
That is such a good question. It makes me think about like 5 different things. So I'm going to try to organize them and put them in some sort of order. What we know from surveys and stuff that have been done about nonprofits is a couple of things. First, after about $5 million, organizations have more resources to be able to put towards data and being to analyze that data, right? Like they're big enough to hire like a part-time data person. And under that, and especially under like $500,000, nonprofits often don't have the resources to put towards data. What some of the surveys also show us is that larger organizations have an easier time meeting their fundraising goals than smaller organizations. And some of that might be capacity. But I'm also guessing that some of that is not being able to talk about and show your impact, because just like you can't like sort of wing your budget, you can't, managing your budget, you can't wing understanding your impact. And it is a set of skills and a way of doing things and looking at numbers that is unique, unfortunately, to every single nonprofit. And so I don't really see them making different kinds of mistakes or having different kinds of strengths in terms of what they're measuring, but I see smaller nonprofits having a much harder time measuring it. And those are the ones that I'm particularly interested in trying to build simple, streamlined, sustainable systems for, because the larger nonprofits have lots of those resources. When you're talking about metrics, I've done this for 20 years, and I've noticed that there are just a handful of things that any nonprofit basically needs to ask. The first one is that they want to measure the accomplishments or capture the accomplishments that people make during programming, right? So do they finish a business plan? Do they, get changes made to their house? Do they get a credential? Do they fulfill a certain kind of requirement? Those are accomplishments. Those also might be things like they've reduced their depression or, reduced their suffering in some sort of other way. Everything else that a nonprofit gives to a client can be summed up by knowledge, skills, and access. So clients either learn something that they didn't learn before, that they didn't know before, so they gain knowledge. They learn how to do something that they didn't know how to do before, or they gain access to or have the ability to do something that they didn't do before. And you can really literally ask those questions in just 3 questions, like what'd you learn to do, and what are you able to do? But sometimes you might want each of those to be a longer set of questions, depending on what it is you gave them. And then the last thing that you really need is you need to know, well, not the last thing, you need to know about confidence. Are they confident they can put it in place? And are they motivated to put it in place? Because that is evidence that they're going to take it into the future. And then lastly, you want to know whether or not they felt that the services kind of met them where they were as a person and in their path, and whether or not they were satisfied with the services. Mm-hmm. So if you look at accomplishments, knowledge, skills, and access, confidence, motivation, and relevance and satisfaction, that is really I haven't met a nonprofit that's human services oriented where a combination of those isn't just what it is they can offer, period.
When it comes to the larger nonprofits and aligning with for-profit businesses, altruistic giving is very popular now, and usually these days, or I should say often these days, it's a requirement of corporate entities and businesses to align with certain nonprofits and certain causes. Have you found, or have you experienced in your field of data and analysis and strategic planning that for-profit partners are requiring certain data to put in front of their boards or their shareholders as a sort of a justification, or is it something they don't really require because they're doing good and they're involved in the community?
So obviously that in corporate environments, it changes, as different as everything else in a corporate environment. But one of the things that's really unique to corporate environments as opposed to foundations or other kind of philanthropy groups or individual donors is that when a corporation gives money to nonprofits to advance goodness, they are not doing it with the direct input of their shareholders, right? So the shareholders aren't necessarily picking what it is that they're investing in. Yet that corporate responsibility unit is investing in lots of things in the community and usually with some sort of structure, like we're interested in advancing this and we're advancing that. And so if you're doing that, then it actually seems to me that it would be even more important to be able to quantify what it is you're doing, not just how much you're giving out into what causes, but that what you're spending of the shareholders' dollars to improve the community is actually making a difference. Because if anybody cares about return on investment, it's going to be shareholders in some great big corporation.
We touched on it a little bit earlier, but talk a little bit about the notion of bad news and the next priority and how that relates to data and nonprofits.
So a lot of folks I've noticed are afraid to measure their impact because they're afraid that they're not going to get the news that they want. And then that will somehow hurt their reputation or something. And I encourage people to take a different frame on it. If you're not getting the results that you want in one area, if you're not getting the results you want anywhere, then you probably need to think about program development and kind of go back to the drawing board, or you're measuring the wrong things. So you need some consultation to figure out what it is you want to do. But usually nonprofits are kicking it in one place, like doing a great job, and kind of not quite meeting their own expectations in another place. And there's two things to do with that. The first is that the leadership really needs to look at what they're not accomplishing and understand why they're not accomplishing it. Do they need more people? Do they need better programming? Is it too tertiary to what it is that they mainly do, so it's not getting the right kind of attention? Is it a problem that's too big to solve and they might need to get down to something else? There are a lot of things that can happen. And I think it's really responsible and important for the board and the leadership and the organization to go, what is going on here and how do we improve it? But when you're going out and you're, asking people for money and talking about your accomplishments, you don't have to put that bad news in there, right? You don't have to go out there and say, we, fed 1 million people, but we didn't manage to get these people Meals on Wheels or something like that. You can publicize the good data and the good news as long as you're working to address what you consider to be bad news. The other thing is that if you're going to be in a healthy data culture, then that bad news should be framed in some strengths-based way. So, we are doing a lot of great work, and this is not getting the attention it needs. So we want to make it our next priority. And now we're going to try to ask for money for it. We're going to put more resources into it. We're going to problem solve about it. We're going to cut it, whatever that is. But dealing with that becomes the next priority. We all have strengths and things we want to work on. And you never run out of things you want to work on. You're just always trying to figure out what's the next most important thing for me to work on. And that's the same thing in a nonprofit. So I don't think of it as success and failure. I think of it as continuous improvement.
What is a typical length of relationship when you are working with a nonprofit? Are are you involved sometimes for the life of the nonprofit or ongoing, or do you do the secret shopper thing where you come in and find the problems, give them a plan, and then off you go?
Mm-hmm. So historically, what I've done is nonprofits have come to me with a very specific kind of question, and then I work with them to answer it. And that's usually very time limited. What I'm doing now, though, is I'm taking all of the knowledge that I've gained over my career, and I've created this model. And I offer this model in two ways to nonprofits, this impact story strategy. One is I do an 8-week academy, and we bring people together online, and I take them through the academy, and they get this really robust toolbox of things that they can use to implement each of the 6 steps of the strategy. And so they can then take all that information and go off and implement it at their organization. We do some practice in the academy too, so that they get some experience doing it. For organizations that don't have the capacity to implement it themselves or would like some help implementing it, then I will contract with organizations to work with them for generally 2 years. And the reason it's 2 years is that for the first year, we put all the strategies in place and we make sure that they're working. And then in the second year, we make sure that they're mastered. And then I leave. And the idea is that I want organizations to be sustainable. I don't want people to get stuff and spend money on stuff that they can't use, or that's not helpful, or that they can't adapt, or that their staff don't understand. And so I go in and I work with them to put those things in place. What I've recently been talking to folks about is how the very small nonprofits, like the under 500,000, 100,000 to 250, they don't actually have the person power to implement anything more than what they're doing. They're already understaffed, like dramatically understaffed. All nonprofits are understaffed, but dramatically understaffed. And so I've been talking with some partners about the possibility of creating like a data support pool where I hire like a good person who can manage data and collect it and do the graphs and facilitate meetings to understand it at your organization, but you only have to buy a small piece of them. So that's more affordable and sustainable to the organization, rather than having to hire someone to do programming who also knows data, or hire a full-time or a part-time data person, not really necessarily knowing what they need or what the quality is. And so that's something I'm thinking about too. And that would be more lifelong. But that's just like nonprofits sometimes like do group bookkeeping. They hire a bookkeeper among them, or sometimes they do HR functions or development functions or something like that when they're really small. They deserve to have all those functions, but they can't afford to hire individuals expert in that.
You sort of touched on, and I wrote it down, what I was going to bring up next. You mentioned person power. I was going to ask you how often, or I don't know if it's what is the most common, but how often do you see that an issue for a nonprofit's growth, and it could be a big one, could be a small one, is exactly that, the person power in the form of, say, learning new software, whether it's doing social media or it's creating content or, accounting software. Is that pretty common, the nuts and bolts of having the time to have someone actually train on these tools that nonprofits or organizations like that could be using to move themselves forward?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, nonprofits are often underfunded and working on a shoestring. And not until COVID did many funders feel like they should fund the core operational expenses of the organization, which is the organization vitality. And so if people, and there's an unending need for nonprofit services, like I said, like it's always evolving, it's always there. We're never gonna solve it unless we make some big structural changes in our community. And so they're always behind. They're never meeting the need. And so it's never actually possible to be fully staffed. Yeah. The question is whether or not you're staffed enough to be able to grow and actually adequately meet the needs of the people you're serving, or whether you're really understaffed and you don't have hours for professional development or supervision or rest, right? Rotating responsibilities or learning something new. And if you don't have the time to do those things, then you probably don't also have the money to fund
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is that you have to pay for, the professional development or the systems or anything that you need to put into place. Nonprofits really are very, very, most of them need a lot more support than they're actually getting to do their work very well.
Along those same lines, and this might be outside of your purview, I don't know. Is there a most common thing you point to if a nonprofit, for example, says, we just don't have the resources to train somebody in all this software and the bookkeeping and stuff? Is there something or a couple things that you say, well, then at least address this? This is something you've got to get a rein on, get a hold on if you want to grow at all, even if you don't have a full-time accountant, you don't have a full-time social media person. Is there something you say you've got to handle this first and foremost?
Well, the Center for Nonprofit Excellence here, and most communities have it, really do a lot of support in the operational and organizational vitality of a nonprofit, helping to develop boards and financial capacity and, fundraising knowledge and management knowledge and all those kinds of things. And they would probably be able to answer that in a broader way for nonprofits. If I think about where I really focus my time, which is on impact,
mm-hmm.
then I would suggest that nonprofits at the very least count how many services they provide and how many people they provide services to, and that they find at least some subsection of the people who they work with and give them that, 7-question survey or something that's like, what was your knowledge, skills, abilities, motivation, confidence, relevance, and satisfaction. And even if you can do that for 5-10% of your population, that's at least like a little dipping of your toe into the pool, and you have more information than you had before. And that should be helpful if there's not anything else that you can do, mm-hmm. And more isn't always better. What I find is that strategic is better. We want to be strategic about what nonprofits are asking, how they're using those evaluation resources and the people's time that they're asking questions of.
That's a good point. And that is also in keeping with branding. And when a nonprofit or any organization is trying to tell their story, tell it as cleanly and as simply as possible, because it's less to process. And they say your mm-hmm. brand, whatever you are, company, product, person, your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room and how quickly they say it. That's a good point. Sometimes simplification helps tell half the story immediately.
Well, most of the time it does, right? If you think about how do we know a for-profit organization is thriving? Well, we either look at their return on investment, or their profits, or we look at their stock market numbers, right? And those are the simple, big numbers that we keep putting, our attention to. And that's the main story. But under that is a very detailed story that people know at various levels, right? People expert in the field might know more about how one organization is doing it than another. Then you've got your board of directors, then you've got your CEO, and then you've got your CFO, and then you've got the people actually doing the work and balancing everything. So nonprofits have that too. You're going to put out numbers that help very quickly and succinctly let people know what it is you're doing and how much goodness you're providing. But then as you go down, you know a lot more about the details. And that's what you need in order to be able to run a good organization.
As we start to draw this to a close, what are some of your favorite aspects that you get to work on and help nonprofits with that? I'm sure you like it all, but is there any one aspect or two that you absolutely love? You'd sink your teeth into it?
Well, the whole reason that I do this is because when I went to graduate school, I'm also a clinical psychologist, and I worked in the clinical department. I worked in the community department, and I really started to see how science can inform a healthier, more thriving community. But I also saw how it wasn't really translated back to the community in ways that it could be used, and that it also was kind of limited. There's, we know a lot about a lot of things, but there's even more things we know nothing about. And so being able to take information and organize it and make it coherent and make it work for people and make it work to help people in the community. That's kind of how I feel like I'm giving back. Even though I earn money doing this, I also just feel like this is kind of a role that is very meaningful to me in the community. I want to be making a difference so that my community is healthier. And I want that to be real. So I that's kind of what drew me to this work in the first place.
Yeah. I totally see that and agree. And agree in that it's nice to bring some logic to emotional issues. And that's nonprofits often are. It started out of a desire to do good, and it's kind of emotional. It's nice when you get that logical backing and some reason backing up what it is you're doing.
Yeah, it kind of balances out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the people who are drawn because their heart is touched, great. They're not going to be turned off by the numbers. And the people who are drawn to the numbers, they're not going to be turned off by the heart touch. But I think you kind of need both.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be able to tell an individual story, and you need to somehow be able to encapsulate the story for everybody.
Yeah. Can't drive a car with good intentions,
No, you can't. That's a great expression.
Well, I just made it up. Feel free. It's yours.
Thank you.
Maryfrances Porter with Partnerships for Strategic Impact. I appreciate you being here, and I'm not letting you go yet because as sort of an underlying theme here is we all don't know what we don't know. Therefore, I like to open it up. Is there anything you'd like to, I mean, we could go for hours with this, but not to throw too much at the audience. Is there anything you'd like to open up or mention that we haven't addressed?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the real take homes for me are that being able to track your data and tell your story, it doesn't have to be harder than managing your budget. You don't have to be a scientist. It's within reach, and it can be sustainable. And that's really kind of the simple message. There isn't really, there isn't actually, it doesn't have to be more complexity to it than that.
That's pretty reassuring, the lack of too much complexity. So how should people get in touch with you? What's the best way?
So they can email me, which is porter@psi-consult.com. Or you can actually just go to my website. I've got all sorts of information about me and the academy and the coaching and ways to get in touch with me and to join my blog. I put out blogs a couple of times a month that give helpful tips and hints. And that's impactstorycoaching.com.
Okay.
So I invite people to go and check it out or email me directly. I love answering questions. So I never tell people not to email me.
That much is obvious, which makes my job really easy. So thank you. And all the socials and everything is on that website, impactstorycoaching.com. Yeah. So cool. Maryfrances, thank you so much for your time
today.
Thanks
for having me. It was really fun.
This has been great. I'd like to pick it up at some point. Maybe we'll get into a little bit more in depth next time. But this has been a great introduction to hard data of emotional issues. So thank you again.
Thanks, Jay. I appreciate you having me.
Thanks again to Maryfrances Porter for being here and shedding some light on a very logical subject that people who are emotionally driven may not consider. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But if you do consider the metrics of running a nonprofit and you need help, get in touch with Maryfrances Partnerships for Strategic Impact. That's it for today. See you next time on another Good Eye Podcast. Thank you for your time, attention, and intention.